Hey there everyone, happy 2016, how are you doing? This is our last night in Palermo, for my vacation in Palermo. It's the 3rd of January, and we managed to find a cinema that was playing The Little Prince. As you know by now, I've been waiting for this film for quite a while, The Little Prince that is, so what better way to celebrate our last night of our vacation by watching this. Hopefully it'll be good. Anyway, as always, I'm going to tell you my opinions of this film once I see it. And that's about it. And, I'll be seeing you again once I come back. And again, Happy New Year. Hi there, it's me, Madhog, and as you can see, this is not my usual environment because I'm filming this in the home that we're staying for our vacation in Palermo, me and my relatives and friends. And like I said, this is the last night we're going to be here, and as I said in the previous scene, we were about to see The Little Prince. Now we saw it. So now I have a fully formed opinion about it I'm going to give to you. Notice that it's not the best setting here. The camera is really precariously placed, and it's my usual shoddy camera. I'm sitting on the floor. There are noises outside the city roaming with life. The illumination is also dubious, but okay, let's get to the point. The Little Prince. What do I think about The Little Prince? It's disappointing. It's very disappointing. I'm going to try and be short and concise about it. Also, I'm going to try to avoid major spoilers unless it's strictly necessary to talk about them in order to describe to you what goes wrong in this film. Because in spite of everything, I still want people to watch this. Heavy, crippling, and infuriating flaws. It's shark-jumping flaws. I still want people to watch this. Because I still want people to get interested in the source material, at the very least. The novel of The Little Prince, written by Antoine de Saint-Exubéry. French. And there were doubts about this film. Doubts crawling in the side of my mind, in the deepest recesses of my brain. Doubts that I tried to forsake for the sake of my enjoyment of this film. But this film, from a presentation standpoint, it really looks like something that's not French. I know it sounds like something very hipstery and pretentious to say, but it's true. I mean, ideally, this film is supposed to be it's supposed to showcase a mixed animation technique. The main narrative, or I should say the narrative that frames the adventures of the Little Prince, which is the story of this little girl with a very forcing mother that basically programs her entire life the way it's supposed to be in her mind to make her the perfect adult, the essential adult, because, you know, criticizing about idiosyncrasies of the adult world as seen from the point of view of a child, or at least a childish point of view, it's one of the main themes of the original novel of The Little Prince. So it makes sense that in an adaptation, or rather in a tribute, this is actually more the case. It's less of an actual adaptation, more of a tribute, more on that later. In an homage to the novel of The Little Prince, it makes sense that the chosen main character and her story serving the purpose of framing the story of the Little Prince, would be in that kind of scenario, in that kind of situation in which she has to rediscover what it means to be a child, and not, and also she needs to understand that growing up does not necessarily mean forgetting what it means to be a child. Because the problem was never growing up or becoming an adult. The problem was that adult people tend to forget that they have been children at some point, and they forget to have fun. Basically, to see the world for that wondrous, cartoonish thing that it is, and they take themselves way too seriously. That's really what The Little Prince in a nutshell is about. Again, the idiosyncrasies of the adult world from a perspective of a child. But, as I was saying, about the mixed techniques, because yes, I said that part of this film is CGI. The other part of this film, at least the part that's been advertised in the trailers, is stop motion animated, with some subtle semblances and uses of hand-draw animation applied to actual stop-motion model. That only happens in one really short scene, the scene that introduces the mystical and magical wondrous world of the Little Prince. Well, while the stop-motion bits are excellent, although a bit too far in between, too little and too scarce in the grand scheme of things compared to the CG of the film. And the CGI is okay at best, but the main problem that I have with the CGI animation of the Little Prince is that it's like they're trying too hard to look like a Pixar film. But they clearly don't have the same budget or the same talent, the animators who made this, compared to an actual Pixar film. And the reason why he tries so hard to look like a Pixar film, other than the obvious reason of trying to make this film as mainstream appealing as possible, which was what actually kind of ruins it at the end, ironically, is because the director of this film, ironically enough, is the same guy who made Kung Fu Panda, which is a DreamWorks film, not a Pixar, so that parallel is... I think I lost the point that I had, but nevertheless, the CG is okay at best, but it ultimately doesn't matter, because for the most part, this is a very enjoyable film. At least 2/3 of it are pretty good, in spite of, well, betraying a fundamental promise that was made to the audience, and I'll explain what I mean later on. And then there is a third part of this film that kind of completely ruins it. And I do mean utterly, thoroughly destroys the film, to the point that you just left the cinema in a perpetual state of confoundment, trying to understand why was this even made. But actually, I think I should start from the beginning. In fact, I should actually talk about the novel proper. Okay, first of all, the original novel is admittedly not an easy work to adapt for a film, for any other medium. There have been several adaptations of The Little Prince preceding this one, including an anime in the early 80s. None of them were quite memorable, hence why nobody remembers them. You see, The Little Prince is a very... it's really not a classically structured story, free-act story. It's more like a series of vignettes, a series of scenarios and small parables piled up together and linked together by one or a couple of important leitmotifs that frame the entire pseudo-narrative. And basically it's this little prince that lives in an asteroid, on an asteroid that's really small. It's basically as big as this room that I'm right now. Basically, it tells about his journeys and his experiences in other asteroids before coming down to Earth. And an interesting interpretation of this story is that each little asteroid was inhabited by one individual that represented a very specific idiosyncrasy of the adult world. There was the king, there was a sovereign of a small planet and pretended to be the ruler of the universe, but he ruled nothing at all. There was this one self-absorbed guy that lived to receive admiration and applauses, but he was alone in his own planet, which is a metaphor for basically our own limited perception of reality that revolves around us. There was the guy, the businessman who counted the stars in the universe because apparently counting them would bring him riches. It's silly. Adults are silly. That's kind of the point. You don't really need to overthink that, which is something that unfortunately the film does in a really, really terrible and disappointing way, but more on that later. Interestingly enough, the novel was framed in a way in which the point of view, yes, the point of view, the first person point of view of the novel was that of an old pilot that whose plane broke down in the Sahara Desert, and that's where he met the little prince, and the little prince told him about the story. It's really important to note that this point of view, while technically adult, never actually forgot what it meant to be a child. In fact, by the deceptively simple way the story was written, it was clear it was meant to convey the fact that the adult pilot guy was still a child at heart, and still did not understand how adults worked, because all these adults pretty much forgot what it meant to be a child to begin with, to have imagination and creativity. To see a snake devouring an elephant instead of a boring hat. You need to read the novel to understand that analogy. So, the question is, how were they going to adapt this story with this particular framing device and this particular non-narrative choices into a medium such as cinema? And the answer was actually kind of clever, because they ended up not making an adaptation of The Little Prince, as I hinted before, but they ended up doing a film that ideally was supposed to be about tributing The Little Prince without actually being properly a Little Prince film. It's not an adaptation of the book, as it is a really metatextual approach to it. Like I said before, there is this story of this little girl, and with their life basically pre-programmed from the start, and she makes friends with her neighbor, which is the old pilot that was the point of view in the book of The Little Prince, that told the story of The Little Prince. And the old man tells her the story of the journeys of the Little Prince and what he learned. That's a great idea in theory, because it kind of cleverly circumnavigates the issue of adapting the book by making a film that talks about the book as it is, but uses a very specific narrative framing, a framing device, that to introduce this book to the audience. And the little girl is clearly supposed to be the self-insert for the audience, the children watching the film. Ideally, she's also the self-insert of the readers of the novel. That's great, again, in theory. And then you realize that the moments in which we actually get to see the Little Prince those short moments in which there is stop motion animation, they are supposed to be how the classic stories of the prince from all the various chapters of the book should be presented to the audience as they are told by the old man. There is little to know of them. There is little to none of those scenes. I mean, the film itself seems to be worried to really quickly rush to one scene to the next and spends exactly less than 1 minute to each individual chapter of the book. The ones it chooses to show up, by the way. And thus we spend the majority of the film with this little girl and her own journey, emotional and journey of growth, which is parallel ideally to the one of the prince, which again, thematically there is nothing wrong with that, but again, in a film called The Little Prince, you'd think you'd be able to see more of the actual Little Prince. But the sad truth is that the story of the little girl, which we're going to call Story A, for convenience sake, while The Little Prince is Story B, Story A is not just a framing device to tell Story B. Story B, it's essentially just a thematic parallel to tell Story A. Story B is used to tell Story A, and not the opposite. That's a problem. This is supposed to be an homage, a tribute to the Little Prince, but it ends up actually exploiting the Little Prince to tell a story that has actually nothing to do with Little Prince outside of the metatextual knowledge that Little Prince is a story that exists within Story A. And you know what? As much as I like to complain about that, the truth is that Story A, on its own merits, is actually pretty good. I mean, ironically enough, if it wasn't titled The Little Prince, and it was titled, for example, The Adventures of Little Girl and Old Man Pilot Guy, just put it there, I wouldn't even be complaining about that, because as its own story it works just fine. It's just so sad that it has to basically force a thematic parallel from the source material that it's supposed to make a film about, only to kind of leave the source material itself to the side to tell mostly the story it wants to tell. Again, it's kind of disappointing, but again, it's really good on its own merits again. In fact, I dare say that the fact that it's actually directly exploiting the Little Prince, forcibly taking the various themes that the novel is famous for to tell its own story, kind of diminishes the worth of Story A. So in the end, the film kind of really becomes its own biggest obstacle. But it's still kind of enjoyable. There's also, although there is also another problem, because, like I said, it borrows themes from the book, which is used as a thematic parallel, etc. The problem is that these themes that the film chooses to focus on, kind of, at some point, begin clashing with each other. Let me explain what I mean. I said before that the original novel of The Little Prince, basically it's about the adult world seen from a childish perspective. But there's more to it than that. In fact, there is a much deeper and darker emotional turmoil behind the story of The Little Prince, because the story is framed around specific events that are inspired from real life experiences of the author himself. Specifically is the tragic resolution of his romantic life, which is represented in the novel and also in the film, or the bits about the novel in the film, by this relationship that the little prince has with the red rose, which he at some point abandons on his planet because there were communication issues derived by the fact that they were both too young to understand love, which is something that's actually part of life once you grow up. Growing up is important. You have to... Growing up doesn't mean forgetting what it means to be a child. It means actually understanding better things that you could not as a child. So growing up is important. The Little Prince acknowledges the importance of growing up. But it also tells you that things were easier as a kid. But you don't have to think about life and death and love and losing love and grief. And yes, The Little Prince is also about death. It's about death, dealing with death, grieving the loss of a loved one, and also learning to live after it, learning to accept it. That the one you love, even though it's no longer with you, it will always be with you in a spiritual sense. I mean, you will remember they existed, so they will never die, really. And really, the actual ending of The Little Prince reflects that. And parallel to that, we have story A, in which the little girl has to deal with the fact that her friend, the old man, has already one feet into the grave. He doesn't have much time left. And he tries to explain that to her by telling her how the little prince, quote unquote, came back home. And that's great. And if the film were about that particular theme, it would have been great. But unfortunately, it also wants to be about, again, the fact that she has a pre-figured out life and the adult world negating childhood and the lack of creativity and conformism, mental conformism of adult age, versus the ability to be free with your mind and all that. Basically, the other half of the thematic journey of the Little Prince. And it's okay to have them both, but both themes in question, both grief and dealing with death and love, and adult world this criticism of the adult world from, again, a child's perspective. It's fine to have them both in the same story, but the problem with the film, and by that I mean the problem with story A of the film, is that unlike the novel itself, The Little Prince, which is story B, it's not very well, they're not very well meshed together. In fact, I dare say there is a fundamental problem of the two themes kind of trying to stealing the spotlight in the same film. There is not a proper transition in between themes. It feels like half of the film is devoted to one theme, the other half is suddenly devoted to the other, and then we come back to this one, and then we come back to this other one. There is not cohesive, coherent thematic transition or thematic, cohabiting of the same film. And then there is the third act. And the third act is where the film comes completely undone, in which both story A and story B are completely and utterly destroyed. It's already kind of irritating. We had so little of The Little Prince to be actually shown in a film that was supposed to be about The Little Prince. And its most famous moments in the novel just have like less than a minute on average, less than a minute of screen time each. But what's really, really devastating is that this film pulls out a Lorax. Remember the Lorax, the adaptation? You know, when basically you have this very similar situation in which the story of the Lorax is told within a story that has nothing to do with the actual Lorax story. That was the Lorax film. And then we have this completely forced, unnecessary, and quite frankly too much long third act that doesn't really accomplish anything. You could just directly cut to the end and nothing will be lost. Something like that happens in here, except it's the most nonsensical mess I've ever seen. Well, not the most I've ever seen, I'm just using a hyperbole, but basically I'm trying to say it's completely insane. I mean, a film about the Little Prince, or at least a film about tributing the importance of the Little Prince as a story for children that are both learning to grow but also learning to be children, which should be the point of this one, suddenly turns into Brazil for children. I'm not even joking. The third act, it's supposed to be this one dream sequence in which the little girl goes on a journey to find the Little Prince to bring him back to his planet, which is completely ridiculous. And we cut to this planet that's basically a distorted representation of our own city in real life. And it becomes Brazil. No, seriously, it's Brazil. It's like the third act of Brazil, except stupid. And it doesn't really belong to anything in this film. And what's worse, you have the characters, the fictional characters, introduced in story B, the actual story of Little Prince, the ones that were established with less than a minute of total running time, and they become the villains of this Brazil-style scenario, and the Little Prince, you know what? I'm actually saying too much. I said I wasn't going to spoil this to you, but the point is, it's completely insane. And it doesn't add anything to the thing. In fact, it detracts. It makes you hate the entire enterprise. And what's worse is that not only it's completely forced, and it doesn't really accomplish anything, and it doesn't really belong, visually or thematically speaking, it doesn't really belong in this same film. But it also goes on forever and ever and ever. It's clear that it's there just to fatten up the running time, otherwise this film will be too short. This film clearly struggles to get to the 90 minutes mark, which is stupid. And what's worth it? Okay, so this is how it completely destroys both story A and story B of The Little Prince. Story A at that point was about, again, learning to cope with grief, and then suddenly we go into basically Brazil. She dreams of Brazil, and it really completely, it goes so over the top. It feels again like it doesn't belong in the same story. And as for story B, it's downright a crime against nature, because it completely bastardizes the original material, and it basically turns into its own self-insert fan fiction, which is bad. This is supposed to be an homage to The Little Prince. This is supposed to be a film about The Little Prince, but it turns out to be the most catastrophically bad, disrespectful, bastardized fan fiction of a beloved children's classic novel. And that's what kills the film completely. No, you know what? Actually, what kills the film completely was seeing the Little Prince not being so little anymore. And with that, I think I said enough. So again, I would urge you to see this. Just expect the first two-thirds of this film to be very good, in spite of really missed opportunities and betrayed promises. And then expect the third act to be the worst thing ever. The worst and most nonsensical and just why is there kind of thing ever. And again, it's too bad because the epilogue, I mean right after the nonsense that I just explained to you, it's also decent. And like I said again, this could have been a decent film if A, did not have this awful third act, and B, it was not a Little Prince film. As it stands, it cannot be a good film about the Little Prince, and it cannot be a good film in its own right because of all these reasons. Such a shame. Well, this has been Madhog, and well, go see it, I guess. Again, Happy New Year!
Suis-moi, qui suis-je, le sais-tu? Suis-moi, ton sosie salut, suis-moi, et si moi c'était toi? Suis-moi.